Hello, my name is Ryotaro, and today I'm going to be talking about the wonders of Kamiak Butte. Kamiak Butte is a county park located in eastern Washington in Whitman County, and this park used to sit adjacent to the ocean until roughly 75 to 100 million years ago, when subduction of the ocean plate created the western parts of the continent. Interestingly, these western parts of the continent did not exist until 75 to 100 million years ago because of a rifting event that occurred roughly 750 million years ago, tearing apart the continent. As such, until 75 to 100 million years ago, everything to the left of the gray belt rock formation shown in this figure did not exist, and it had to be formed later from terrains pushing up against the continent and accretion happening in that area. Recapped here is a figure of how this process would work. Interestingly, the quartzite of Kamiak Butte was scraped off the Juan de Fuca plate. This is very important, as Kamiak Butte is notorious for having cracked quartzite substrate, which allows water to seep through very quickly and means that Kamiak Butte is the home to many dry adapted plants. Next in the conversation, we'll talk about basalt flows and flooding. Up first is basalt flows. The Columbia River basalts occurred roughly 5 to 17.5 million years ago and occurred in 3 phases. Circled here in red is the main phase, which is when most of the basalts came out of the lands the quickest. This was roughly 16.7 to 15.6 million years ago, and it is interesting to think about how the majority of the basalts did not come out of the lands as soon as the Columbia River basalts came active, as one would think that as soon as the basaltic formation became active, that's when the most rapid basalts would come flooding out of the lands. But no, this was not the case. Prior to the main phase was the initial phase, so everything in the Columbia River basalt that occurred before 16.7 million years ago, and then the waning phase, which was everything after the main phase. Shown in this figure, there were very few formations that came about during the waning phase of the Columbia River basalts. Next, in the basalt flows and flooding conversation, flooding is important to discuss. So Kamiak Butte and or the lands surrounding Kamiak Butte were affected by 2 main flooding groups, the Missoula floods, which most people know about, and the Bonneville flood, which as opposed to the Missoula floods was only a one-time event. So, the Missoula floods. They were caused by the recession and refreezing of ice sheets, repeatedly releasing lake water, which flooded the landscape over and over and over, 15 to 18,000 years ago. On the other hand, the Bonneville flood was a one-time flood in Utah, which occurred 17,400 years ago. So, how are these floods relevant to Kamiak Butte? Well, the slackwater sediments created by Missoula and the Bonneville floods blew over to Pullman and created loess soils. Additionally, the flood basalts covered the Palouse and a very, very small amount of Kamiak Butte, but overall did not affect Kamiak Butte much at all. Thus, Kamiak Butte is not basaltic, and as stated before, is quartzite substrate, which makes it very unique to the surrounding landscapes, which are almost completely covered in the Columbia River basalt group. This means that the surrounding farmlands, which have the combination of both the basalts, which do not allow water to seep through too quick, and the loess soils, which are very good at holding nutrients, make it so that Pullman has a very productive wheat growing and lentil growing activities. Now that geology has been briefly discussed, we will move on to the climate and weather of Kamiak Butte. Kamiak Butte is located in the marine modified continental macroclimate. This means that it has maximum precipitation during winter, it has cold winters, and it has arid summers, as most of us who have lived in Pullman for a while have come to realize. Shown here is a figure of the same site on Kamiak Butte, 2 months apart in each of the 3 frames. Because roughly 60% of the precipitation on Kamiak Butte comes from snow, almost all the precipitation that plants used to grow during the growing season on Kamiak Butte, which is most prominent during May, comes from snowmelt. Thus, there is a delay between when the snow, or the precipitation, falls and when the plants actually grow on Kamiak Butte. In addition to precipitation differences, it is important that the temperature is above 40 degrees Fahrenheit such that plant growth can occur at all. Roughly 2 weeks a year, during an event which may be easy to miss because of how brief it is, lots of flowering occurs on Kamiak Butte. This includes species such as arrowleaf balsamroot, acute paintbrush, and hairy vetch, shown in this figure from 2022 on the south-facing microsite. Additionally, in 2021, Kamiak Butte experienced what is known as the drought on the Palouse. Although Kamiak Butte was affected, and animals had smaller antlers because there was less food availability, the main impact of the drought on the Palouse had to do with farming. Circled in red is to help show the differences between the minimum temperature in 2021 and the minimum temperature average between 1895 and 2021, a much longer climatic period. Clearly, during the growing season, there was much higher temperatures in 2021, which could have put heat stress on the plants. Additionally, preceding the growing period where the temperature was above 40 degrees, there was very little precipitation, shown in the orange bars, for the parts per thousand of rain that fell in 2021. Restated, the growth requirements for plants are a temperature above 40 degrees Fahrenheit for over 24 hours for the stomata to open, and sufficient precipitation. These conditions clearly did not exist before or during the growth period during 2021. As such, it has been dubbed the 2021 Drought on the Palouse. Moving on from climate and weather, there was also field trip data gathered about Kamiak Butte. In this data, the main things discussed were biomes and trees. Kamiak Butte is located in the North America Western Interior Woodlands and Shrublands biome. This biome is a host to many types of plants, including Idaho fescue, bluebunch wheatgrass, snowberry, and many more. Kamiak Butte also has vast differences in its tree formations and other plant growth between the microsites. On first glance, one may think that this is due to the rain shadow effect, but this could be further from the truth. In reality, because one of the slopes faces north and the other slope faces south, it is the differences in sun exposure that cause the changes between these sites. The main species of trees on the north aspect are ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and western larch, whereas ponderosa pine is almost the sole species on the south-facing aspect. Data were gathered about the diameter at breast height, quadratic mean diameter, and heights of trees on the north versus the south microsite. As seen, the diameter at breast height is very similar between the microsites. However, the height on the north microsites is much higher for the trees because there is more moisture and there is less heat striking these plants. Additionally, the trees are much denser on the north aspect for the same reasons that there is higher trees on the north aspect. There are about 130 trees per acre on the north aspect as opposed to only 35 on the south aspect. In addition to class-mandated data, I also gathered my own data about leaf morphology on Kamiak Butte. Using a rope to gather different heights and using a tally counter to keep track of needles, I determined whether or not there was a relationship between the tree height and the length of needles on south-facing trees on Kamiak Butte. So, my expectation was that higher up in the tree there would be smaller leaves, as this is the case in many tropical trees. However, I actually did not find this to be the case at all. Instead of leaves becoming smaller towards the top of the trees, the overall trend was that they seemed to become larger. That said, this is a very small sample size, and if one ignores the lines of best fit and simply looks at the dots where the means exist, it is clear that this pattern is most likely random and that the leaves do not in fact become larger towards the tops of trees. Here is the same information displayed in the box plot, and again, although at first glance it might seem that there is a pattern, overall it appears that the distribution of needle length is random. There are an infinite amount of things which could be studied about Kamiak Butte, and Kamiak Butte is taken for granted by those who live near it, yet unknown by those who don't. Hopefully, anthropogenic influence decreases over time such that this site can be preserved and enjoyed by many, many people for years to come.